Today, on the Liberty Report, we're joined by author of The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. Mark Gevisser is joining us on the Liberty Report to spill the tea on his latest book, one that I am very excited about because it contributes so robustly to the conversation about the state of LGBTI rights in the world today. Other books by Mark Gevisser include Lost and Found in Johannesburg, Defiance Desire that he co-authored with former Constitutional Court Judge Edwin Cameron, A Legacy of Liberation, Portraits of Power, and The Dream Deferred. Mark also writes a monthly column for Business Day called The Monthly Review. I first met Mark when my piece, Site Visits, which explores a nude bar in Johannesburg called The Factory, was first published in the second volume of the Gerald Clark anthology, for which Mark was one of the judges. To read that piece, visit welcomemandla.com. Mark was a judge on the Gerald Clark anthology alongside Sisonke Msimang, Professor Sylvia Tamale, and Otto Sorieze Obi Young. Since the publication of the Gerald Clark anthology, Mark has been a mentor and a good friend in my own writing journey for my first book. I believe he has some very important insights to share, not only around the journeys across the world's queer frontiers, but he also has some wonderful and important advice to share about writing, which I hope and believe you will find useful. Take a look. What is the Pink Line for people who don't know what the Pink Line is, and how did you decide to make, the idea of the Pink Line central to the book?
Welcome. Thank you so much for that. The Pink Line is a new global human rights frontier that I've come to see divides and describes the world in a whole new way, in a way that was really unimaginable a generation ago. And the concept of the Pink Line actually came to me when I began the research of this book in 2009, which was the year that my partner Chetty and I got married, because South Africa is famously, on paper at least, a place that is a pioneer in LGBT rights. And I was very struck by reading in the same year that we got married, which got me the spousal benefits on his new job in Paris and enabled me to go and live in France for a while. I was very struck by how that very same year I read in the newspapers about a couple in Malawi, north of the border, Tiwonge Chimbalanga and Stephen Monjeza, who, as a result of their public declaration of love, an engagement ceremony, rather than getting, a marriage certificate and a ticket to Paris the way I did, received an arrest and an absolutely degrading and humiliating trial where they were eventually convicted to 14 years hard labor for carnal knowledge against the order of nature. And I thought that there's a pink line dividing, my experience and theirs. And I wanted to try and understand how this pink line in the world of today, in this era of globalization and digitization, is a geopolitical phenomenon that runs between countries, if you like, between South Africa and Malawi, that runs through countries, because we can talk about our own country and the pink line between the lofty aspirations of the law and reality on the ground for queer people, and a pink line that runs between as well, I would say, the kind of liberation and freedom and sense of community you might have online if all you need is a smartphone and a little bit of bandwidth and some privacy. The pink line between that and the real life world, when you look up from your phone into the eyes of a disapproving parent, or a church that says, you're a sinner, or a state that says what you're doing is illegal. So there's this dissonance in our world at the moment, which I think is something quite new in many parts of the world, between the possibilities of liberation and freedom and the realities of life on the ground.
what inspired you to take this particular form in executing this book? Because you visit some of these places and you provide such rich descriptions of the lived experiences of the people. How did you decide to go about executing the book this way?
You know, I think at times that the book was crazily overambitious because I really wanted it to have a global reach. But in my own practice as a journalist, and this goes all the way back to, you know, the beginning of my career where I made a name for myself in South Africa writing profiles in the Weekly Mail about politicians and senior figures who were negotiating the transition from apartheid to democracy. And from then on, I've always believed that the best way of understanding sort of complex socio-political phenomena, the best way of understanding change in society is for a writer, for a journalist, is to sit on the shoulder of the person experiencing the change and see the world the way they see it. So rather than having, you know, the God's eye view omniscience, which is the traditional perspective of a journalist, I want to be on the ground with people experiencing what's going on. And I want to try and see the world as much as possible the way they see it. Because I know that for myself as a reader, I understand things so much more clearly when I see things through the eyes of a protagonist. I know this is a reader of fiction as well as non-fiction. How important a protagonist is fiction. In fiction, and as a reader of fiction, I like to carry that notion across into my work as a non-fiction writer. So it was absolutely essential for me, even if I was doing this big global study, to see the dynamics, to understand the dynamics through the eyes of people who are being impacted on by change, but are also impacting the change. And I think that's really critical because one of the dynamics of the Pink Line is that queer people are given a significance that often has very little to do with them. They're seen as agents of Western imperialism, for example. They're seen as, or from the other side, they're seen as these people who need to be saved, you know, by the West from the clutches of evil Ugandan or Nigerian regimes. And they're very seldom seen as themselves. And for me, it was therefore an ethical as well as a narrative prerogative to acknowledge the agency of people who live on the Pink Line by telling their stories as much as possible, as close as possible to where they actually are in the world.
It made me think of the conversation we had as well for Pride Afrique, for the inaugural lecture of Pride Afrique, with Otto Serieza, who said that we should be able to write about queer experiences in ways that don't other us. And I thought this was a good example of that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's really an ambition of mine. Now, obviously, there is some distance between myself as the writer and the people I write about. That is structurally unavoidable. And the only way of avoiding that structural challenge is to write about myself. And frankly, I'm not so interesting. I think the other people I'm writing about are much more interesting.
I think you're much more interesting than you think.
but I'm not in this. I've written a memoir. My last book, Lost and Found in Johannesburg, is a memoir. But this book is not a memoir. It's not about me. It's about the people I write about. But I need to acknowledge my presence and my positionality in the task. Once more, I can't pretend to have this God's eye view, but I can't pretend to be the person themselves. If I'm writing about Tiwonga, the Malawian transgender woman who got married in that marriage I was telling you about, I can't invade Tiwonga and write as if I were her. So there's the book is in many ways about my relationship with these people and how I come into their worlds and what I see and how they see me as well and how I perceive the way they see me. Because if one of the things I'm doing is writing, I mean, I'm very interested in the pink line as being a phenomenon of the era of globalization, when no one lives in a discrete little bubble anymore. Even in the village, in the fishing village in South India that I go to, where really only one person has a smartphone, ideas of the bigger world, seep in. So in this world where ideas travel so fast, and where ideas and ideologies are carried, from the West to the rest, from the city to the countryside, from through the internet, through CNN, through whatever. I have to understand myself as one of those vehicles, one of those vectors. And when I arrive in a small village in South India or at a queer sidewalk cafe in Cairo, or when I meet a young Ugandan man who's been thrown out of home, I mean, he sees me in a certain way as an older white gay man. And I have to acknowledge that, and I make a point of acknowledge that in the book, and by kind of looking at the relationships that develop as a consequence of that, as a way of trying to understand the dynamics of the pink line.
You tell us, like, reading this, I also remember thinking it read like so much work, like years and years worth of research, because of the relationship you maintain with the people that you're writing about throughout the years. Can you give us a sense of what that was like?
So I should begin by saying that was, if I'm going to try and understand change by sitting on the shoulders of people effecting that change and experiencing that change in their lives, change in the world, I've got to put in the time. So I emphatically didn't want to sort of dip in and dip out, spend a day with Welcome and think I can write Welcome's life. I wanted to watch how the people I was writing about were dealing with their worlds, were dealing with living on the pink line. And I wanted to do it over time, and it was hugely challenging because of time and money, and more money than time. And I was very lucky to receive a fellowship from the Open Society Foundations, which enabled me to do my first round of research. So I was able, all the people I write about, I was able to visit at least once that way. And then through selling journalism, I was able to visit them twice, maybe 3 times. But even that's not enough, because, I mean, even if those visits were a few days at a time, you still are dipping into somebody's life and dipping out of it again. And so what I came to rely on quite heavily, and I think quite appropriately, given the themes of the book, is social media. And I developed very rich online relationships with the people I was writing about.
Yes.
And this sort of helped me in 2 ways. Firstly, I followed them. So I saw what they were doing,
yes.
how they were presenting themselves. But that's potentially a trap, because, as there's something quite performative about social media.
Yes,
You're constructing a version of yourself that you put online. So, but that was interesting to me because so much of my book is about how we construct these versions of ourselves, these queer versions of ourselves, to put online, and what the difference is between those queer versions we put online and the realities of life offline. So I could work with that. But it also enabled me, by having these online relationships with the people I was writing about, I could check in with them often. So using any one of a number of platforms, I was able to, have chats with them from time to time and see how they were doing. Now, in some cases that was challenging, because I write about people, in 10 different countries, many of whom don't speak English, and I don't speak their language. So, if I wanted to speak to Amira in Cairo, I had to get hold of Noor, who is our interpreter, And Noor had to cross the city of Cairo to find Amira, and particularly given that Cairo is a 24-hour city, and it's so busy, it takes so long to get from one side to the other. By the time we were actually talking, it would be like 3 a.m. my time, But I would have to be up for that. Or if I wanted to speak to Lakshya, the person I write about in Cuddalore in South India, Lakshya had to get to Chennai 3 hours by bus away, because that's where my interpreter lived. So, obviously I had to pay for the transport for Lakshya to get there, make sure it suited Lakshya to go there. Those sort of logistics were very complicated, but I was up for it. I was up for the challenge of that, because I really thought it was important to remain connected with these people, and to see how their lives changed as the politics of their countries changed. So to watch in real time Michael Bhattacharya, the young Ugandan man, flee Uganda and go into exile in Kenya, and apply for asylum in Canada, and get to Canada, and also to, while I'm watching this, to have my hand over my mouth, because it's not my job to influence things. And frankly, I believe that Michael made the wrong decision to leave Uganda.
By going to Canada?
By going to Kenya and then Canada. I didn't believe at the time it was the right decision, but I can't influence him.
Yeah.
He made that decision, so I had to just sit and watch it. And as I say, keep my hand over my mouth to say, listen.
I especially enjoyed that story, amongst many others, how it really developed and how you tracked it, how you tell the story from how he moves, Uganda to Kenya to Canada, and it's told such that we feel like we are there, with him and witnessing this. And I really enjoyed that. Another thing you said in the book that resonated, I thought, that as queer people, we are now able to express ourselves. And in the book, you talk about how this has caused moral panics, in different parts of the world. You write very well about how the politics between the West and the rest, like you were saying earlier, play a big role in terms of these moral panics. What is the heart of these moral panics that are being caused by the visibility of LGBTI people?
I suppose that there's many ways of getting that. Another way of thinking about it, which is underground and above ground, and how in so many societies, if you like, non-normative sexual behavior was and is tolerated so long as it remains out of sight, right? So long as you play by the rules of the patriarchy, above ground, get married, have children, do the right thing.
Not visible as queer.
You can do what you like with your libidinal desire, but do it out of sight, and certainly don't claim any rights associated to it. That's the way sexuality has worked in most parts of the world through time. Now in the West, starting with the Industrial Revolution and the moving of people from the countryside, from feudal relations into the city, into a capitalist system where they were being valued by their productivity rather than for their reproductivity, people began to claim some space to live their lives the way they wanted to, rather than the way they were told to. And that this coincides with liberal democracy, where you can claim rights if you join together with other people like you, on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of gender, on the basis of sexual orientation. And this is how a gay rights movement starts, first in Germany, and then later in, early in the 20th century, and then later in in the United States, later with Stonewall, later in the 20th century, fighting for the right to be yourself and not to be policed if you decide you want to come out. And that's a battle that's sort of been fought in the West, and we can talk about how whether it's been won or lost. But the impact of this right now in the world is that because of the digital revolution that I've described, because of a globalizing human rights culture, because of our ability to consume media, no matter where we are, people all over the world are beginning to say, or have been beginning to say, over the last couple of generations, it's no longer okay for me to keep my sexuality on the down low and to get married to a man and have kids if I'm a woman, if what I really want to do is be with a woman. It's no longer okay for me to wear a dress if really what makes me feel best is to put on jeans and have a chiscorp if I'm a woman. So, and I have that right, and I'm going to fight for that right. So that's a real provocation to patriarchal norms, and it's very scary, particularly in societies that don't tolerate any kind of civic society activism, public activism as well. And so this is happening. This new category of people are claiming rights at the same time that states are trying to assert their borders, assert their ability to control their citizens in an age where it's becoming increasingly difficult because of globalization. Also at a time where an understanding of sexual orientation as a category, of gay people as a category, of transgender people as a category, is becoming more known because of media. And so what states do, or what actors do, political actors, religious actors do, is in part to distract attention from other problems they have, in part as a form of populist nationalism, to say this is what makes us different from the West, this is how we need to protect themselves, and in part to control these new people who are claiming rights. They foment moral panics, or they don't foment the moral panics themselves. It's actually usually the media that foments the moral panic. You know, somebody, a journalist hears that Tiwonga Chimbalanga is getting engaged and runs off and takes photographs, and then the Malawi Nation runs a headline saying "gays engage," and suddenly it's sensational, and this gives the authorities an opportunity to clamp down and to foment this moral panic, which says, you know, we've got this new problem in our midst called gays, and it's coming from the West, and we have to clamp down or it's going to corrupt our society. And the society gets so busy on this that the society stops noticing that, in fact, there's much more serious corruption in that society, which is the state corruption of the Malawian government. So it serves that purpose of distracting attention, but while at the same time it pushes queer people back underground because they're terrified this is going to happen to them too. So it's a very sophisticated strategy, this fomenting of moral panics, and it's not single-headed. It's not necessarily in some countries, in authoritarian countries like Russia, it is masterminded, you know, from the Kremlin, because you know Putin has the power to do that. So Putin can make sure that Russian media puts out this terribly homophobic material. In other countries like Nigeria or Malawi or Uganda or Indonesia, it's less controlled, but it is this coming together of right-wing religious forces and political forces to assert control and to make an argument against this minority claiming rights.
I wondered what this means. This conflict between the African states that are saying LGBTI or queerness, LGBTI people or queerness is un-African, versus the Western states that are on a mission to civilize, African states. What this means for queer.
This is the point, and I think I'm glad you put it that way, because the pink line is defended on both sides. and it becomes a vicious cycle in the way it's defended on both sides. Because on the one side, the African leaders or the Middle Eastern leaders or the Eastern European leaders are saying this is a Western depredation of our society, a secular Western depredation of our society, and they're using it to sort of rally populist support. But on the other side of the pink line, you've got culture warriors who are saying, you know, this is what makes us civilized and them barbaric, is that we support gay rights and they don't. And you see this play out in Europe in a very difficult way at the moment. So in Europe, what you see, for example, is anti-immigration, racist, right-wing political parties claiming that one of the reasons why you need to stop immigration, particularly of Muslim people to Europe, is because Muslim people are homophobic. And they are going to, you know, attack European values, which include gay rights or LGBT rights at the moment. And those politics have been very powerful in countries like the Netherlands. In fact, they were invented in the Netherlands by a gay politician called Pim Fortuyn, who later got assassinated. But they're very powerful in France, they're very powerful in Germany too. And they're very pernicious. And because what they do is they help fuel the arguments in the rest of the world that homosexuality is a Western thing. And what's so difficult for queer people in Indonesia, in Russia, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Malawi, is that just by voicing this notion that they're entitled to rights, they're seen as puppets of the West. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that's set up that and particularly if they get support from the West, which
I was about to say the support has not
and the support comes financially through funders, through organizations like the Open Society Foundation, which funded my work. The support also comes diplomatically at the United Nations, where the countries that are promoting LGBT rights have tended historically to be from the West, and really the challenge for queer people is to break that dichotomy, and there's powerful ways that I see that happening. Like, it's been really interesting to see, for example, how at the United Nations the lead is taken by Latin American countries in support of LGBTQ rights, more than European countries. They've really shone at the United Nations as supporters of LGBTQ rights. And in fact, Latin America has become one of the most progressive parts of the world when it comes to these rights, which is another story. We can talk about that a bit. That's one way. Another way is seeing the way activists on the ground, in their calling for their rights, are not just referring to the sort of Western liberal human rights framework, but to their own traditions. So, we in our part of the world, that might mean using the philosophy of Ubuntu, or it might mean unearthing and excavating all the words in Nguni languages for different kinds of genders. It might mean acknowledging even more strongly the way in traditional indigenous knowledge systems, gender non-conforming people are seen to be closer to the ancestors, because maybe if I'm born female but I behave in a very male way, I have a close relationship to a male ancestor, and that might give me the powers of being a Sangoma. And it's unearthing and rehabilitating these ways that non-Western cultures have traditionally dealt with non-conformity or non-normativity, and centering them so that it stops being seen as such a Western thing. In Nigeria.
I think that's so important. especially, and you also mentioned this in the book, and everyone I think knows at this point that these values emanated in Europe in the first place. The homophobia and the buggery acts that were passed were actually brought in to our continents and many of our parts of the world, and that excavating and going back to those frameworks before the UK contaminated the gender, I don't know if I can say gender system that was at work. I really love that.
No, that's really important, but one's also got to guard against what one of my colleagues, the really brilliant political scientist Rahul Rao, who writes about this, and he warns about guarding against a sort of Afro-romanticism, about this knowledge, this idea that before the colonizer came along, this was
everything was perfect.
One really big happy field where you could play around polyamorously in whatever gender you wanted. The patriarchy has existed. It's absolutely correct that the colonizer brought the Buggery Act and the notion of sodomy. Brought the Bible and the law book, which defined homosexuality in a very particular way as sinful. It's also absolutely correct that that the colonizer brought a very narrow notion of what a family is, right? A husband, a wife, and children, a narrow nuclear notion of what a family is. But the patriarchy has worked in all sorts of ways, in the African terrain and elsewhere, long before colonization came about too. And I think we also need to acknowledge that, and I don't think there's a problem with this, by the way. I find it very generative and creative. I think we need to acknowledge that when we unearth and rehabilitate these practices, we're making them suit our own purposes.
A new pink line, which is gender identity, and as something that exists within the LGBTI movement, and of course within our broader society, the insistence on holding on to the gender binaries of male or female, and there being very little room for anything in between.
Each generation finds a way of challenging the holy cows of their elders, and in my generation, certainly in the terrain of gender and sexuality, it was around sexual orientation. There's a younger generation that is coming up that is increasingly challenging the gender binary of their elders as they are developing their own theories of gender, and as they are beginning to understand, with the help of science, gender more as a spectrum than as a binary. So it's become something of a generational battle as well, this new pink line. A pink line between younger people and older people. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't older people who are trans or gender non-conforming too, but it's really become part of the culture of younger people, of many younger people, this acknowledgement of the spectrum. What makes it so complicated, this new pink line, is that it's fought on two fronts. Because ever since the 1970s, there's been a strain of radical feminism that's been very opposed to transgender identity, and very opposed really to the concept of gender identity, a belief that biology alone determines your gender. So the only thing that can make you a woman is your reproductive capacity. And so now trans people are having to fight on two fronts, because as trans rights are developing, and as more and more countries are granting trans people the right to self-determination, which means I can decide I'm a woman without anybody having to certify me and say I have an illness or a condition. I can just say I'm a woman, and therefore I'm a woman. That's now the case in many countries in the world, from Argentina to Ireland to Denmark. trans activists are trying to get that to happen in the United Kingdom, and there's huge pushback, not from the religious right, because there's not much of a religious right in Britain, but from feminists who say that this is going to profoundly affect women's only space in society, important women's only space, whether it's on a sports field or safe space, such as in havens, or jobs that are protected for women due to affirmative action, that all of this is going to be challenged. So it's a very, very difficult fight, this fight, and we're coming into an era where we're going to see this fight more and more. And at the core of this fight is a battle over what is called gender ideology. This notion that comes both from some of the feminist left, but also the religious right, that gender is a new ideology that's being imposed on people and that's being taught to children the way communism was once taught to children in Soviet societies, and that it has to be resisted at all costs. And even supposedly liberal religious actors like Pope Francis is virulently opposed to this thing of gender ideology and sees it as a new form of ideological colonization. And gender ideology, in a nutshell, according to them, is this idea that who we are in the world, gender-wise, is a construct rather than something dictated by our biology. But really, after generations of feminist scholarship, to deny that our gender is a construct seems to me to be kind of going back in time. You know, gender is constructed by society and by our relationship to society, and clearly one of the determinants in that construction is our biology, but it's not the only one.
The cost of choosing to be visible as a queer person has resulted in a lot of progress for the LGBTI movement, but also, you know, a lot of costs for the people who have chosen to be visible. Like when we think of Auntie's story and what happened to her because she got married and it became visible that that's who she was.
I think that visibility is undoubtedly an important part of the movement for queer people to be able to live their lives as themselves. And you see, for example, how in some societies, as a consequence of visibility, and you get to know that, you know, your child, your neighbor, your butcher, your baker, your president is queer, and you get to see that these people aren't demons, but they're your own flesh and blood. So clearly visibility is really important. But I think that we mustn't make a fetish of visibility, and say that visibility at all counts is what's needed, because particularly in cultures where the family and the clan remain so central, it can be very dangerous to be visible. And it might not be advisable even to be visible or publicly visible in that sort of gay rights, come out wherever you are, San Francisco, Castro, Christopher Street way. So that's, I think, one thing to say is that one has to negotiate the territory of what visibility means in different contexts. The other thing I would have to say is that I think you're absolutely right that that there were costs for everybody I wrote about to being visible. And in fact, one of the reasons I chose the people I chose was because of the costs that they've paid, because of their visibility. Now, the question is whether that visibility is a choice or not. And I think that's an important question. And I ruminate on this, particularly in my conclusion. So I asked myself, I tell the story, for example, of Pasha, a transgender woman who, as a result of transitioning in Russia, lost access to her child. And I said to Pasha, do you regret having transitioned because of what the consequences have been for you? And she said to me, I have no choice. I had no choice. If I didn't transition, I was going to kill myself. I wasn't able to continue living the way I was.
I was so moved by that.
That raises a whole lot of questions. One question is that what if she lived in a society where she didn't even know that transition was available? You know, in other words, in a society where she had no access to digital media. Would she still have felt this dissonance that created a sense of suicidal, despair? That's an interesting question. Or would she have just killed herself or harmed herself, and we might not have even known that the reason for this was that she was transgender? So gender non-conforming people, I feel like there are some people who I interviewed who made a choice for political or personal reasons to be visible. But there are others, because they're gender non-conforming, who really didn't have a choice. I mean, they were marked.
What's your advice to, especially queer people who are trying to working at writing and improving their writing? What's your advice to us?
Anybody can learn how to put a good sentence together, but there are three things you have to have if you want to do this job well. You have to have curiosity.
Yes.
You have to be really curious about yourself and about the world, both. You have to have persistence. You have to be able to show up to work every day. You have to be able to go back again and again and again to your people or your sentences. And you have to have empathy. You have to be able to put yourself into somebody else's shoes and try and understand the way they see the world. I would say, even if you're writing memoir, because there are other people in your world if you're writing about yourself. And you have to be able to leave yourself and then come back to yourself. And when I say put yourself in somebody else's shoes, I don't mean steal their shoes. I don't mean appropriate their story. I don't mean abuse their story. I mean respect their story, honor their story. But I think that empathy is absolutely critical. And I think that one of the things that really concerns me about our world, particularly in the digital age, and particularly given all the very important discussions that are had about who has the right to tell other people's stories, is that we could land up becoming a culture of self-centered narcissists if we lose the curiosity and the empathy that helps us try and understand how other people live.
On that note, a big thank you for your curiosity, persistence, and empathy that has resulted in this beautiful book. I think this book will go a long way in queer literature, and I think in affirming the next generation of queer people that, their lives matter and their stories most importantly matter, because you do treat the stories in here with utmost respect. Thank you for talking to me and for your time.
Welcome. Thank you for being such an empathetic and sensitive reader. It's
Thank you.
I feel like I write books to find readers like you, so I'm really grateful. Thanks a lot.